On the third night before her wedding, Leora found herself staring at a sleek stack of papers pushed across the dark mahogany table. Her future in-law's voices echoed in her mind. "Sign this, or there will be no wedding." At the very top, in bold letters, one word stood out: prenup. Her hands quivered. What they didn't realize was that Leora was far from the naive bride they believed her to be. Behind her composed smile, she carried a secret worth $79 million, along with an attorney who had been waiting for this very situation. Leora was the type of woman people admired instantly. Her gentle smile, her soothing voice, and her calm presence made others feel safe. Whenever she entered a room, even the air seemed to brighten. To Daxon, she wasn't only a fiancée. She was the woman who had brought laughter and peace into a once troubled life. Friends often said he had changed since meeting her. He grew softer, kinder, and truly happier because of Leora's love. To outsiders, they looked like the perfect couple. Two people genuinely in love, ready to build a beautiful future together. But not everyone saw that picture the same way. Behind polite smiles and tailored clothes, Daxon's parents watched Leora with wary eyes. They never voiced it aloud, but suspicion lingered in their hearts. They whispered to each other that no woman could love their son without expecting something in return. To them, Leora's kindness was nothing but a disguise, hiding selfish motives. They believed she wanted their wealth, their family's privilege, the security that came with their name. Every time she laughed with Daxon, they wondered if it was genuine or calculated. Whenever she planned the wedding with joy, they told themselves she was only thrilled about the luxury that awaited her. While others celebrated Leora as the ideal bride, Daxon's parents saw her as a threat to their fortune. In their minds, she was nothing more than a gold digger with a sweet smile. Leora, however, had no idea how deep their doubts ran. She moved with sincerity, believing her love was enough to win their trust. She truly thought she was being welcomed as a daughter, never realizing that every step she took, every word she spoke, was being weighed with silent judgment. To the world, she was the bride everyone envied. But to the people closest to Daxon, she was a danger waiting to be exposed. The wedding was only 3 days away, and the evening was supposed to be filled with warmth, laughter, and family closeness. Leora dressed with care, eager to spend time with the family she hoped would soon be her own. She expected kindness, perhaps even a chance to bond before the big day. But as she sat at the long dining table, something felt off. The smiles looked forced, the atmosphere unusually heavy, and Daxon's parents exchanged subtle glances that made her uneasy. When the last dish was cleared, Daxon's mother suddenly reached into her handbag. Without a word at first, she drew out a folder and slid it across the polished surface. The sound of the papers against the wood echoed in the silence. Leora glanced down and saw that single word at the top: prenup. Her chest tightened. Then came the voice, sharp and cold. "If you truly love our son, prove it by signing." It wasn't a question. It was a command. Daxon's father leaned back in his chair, eyes locked on her, waiting for her reaction. Daxon himself sat still, his hand twitching near his glass, but he said nothing. The silence was crushing. The room, once filled with clinking silverware and soft chatter, now felt like a courtroom. And Leora was the one on trial. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears, uneven and heavy, as every gaze pressed down on her. She understood this had nothing to do with love. It was about mistrust that had been buried until now. Her throat went dry, and her fingers trembled beneath the table. She wanted to ask why, to remind them she had given nothing but her heart to their son. But their faces showed no softness, only suspicion wrapped in authority. To them, love wasn't enough. They demanded proof, signed, sealed, undeniable. That night, the image of a welcoming family she had held on to shattered. Leora realized she wasn't at a dinner table, she was at a test. A test meant to strip away her dignity and question the love she thought was pure. The demand lingered in the air like ice, cutting into her chest. And the silence that followed carried more weight than words ever could. Her eyes lingered on the prenup. But what hurt most wasn't the paper, it was the look in Daxon's eyes. He wasn't surprised. His hands shifted restlessly, his gaze darted away, his lips pressed tight as though he'd expected this all along. And that was when the truth struck her. Daxon had known. He had allowed his parents to plan this trap, to spring it on her without warning. The man she trusted, the man she was ready to marry, had stayed silent. Her heart cracked into pieces. This wasn't just about a prenup. It was about betrayal. Before vows were exchanged, before rings touched their fingers, their trust had already been broken. The love she thought was built on honesty now felt fragile and uncertain. She had imagined Daxon standing beside her, shielding her from anything that threatened their bond. Instead, he sat frozen, refusing to meet her eyes, while his parents pushed her toward humiliation. A wave of sorrow swept over her, but she didn't let it show. Her expression stayed composed, her hands resting firmly on the table, though inside she trembled. She longed to shout, to demand why he hadn't stood up for her, why he chose silence instead of love. But Leora wasn't the kind of woman who fought with tears or raised voices. In that instant, she recognized something far greater. That silence could be her sharpest weapon. So she hid her pain beneath a delicate smile. She carried herself as though betrayal hadn't shattered her heart, as though his family's demand hadn't slashed through her vision of a genuine marriage. Her gaze swept calmly across Daxon's parents, even softening as it landed on him, though he hadn't earned such gentleness. What none of them realized was that, behind her stillness, a plan was already unfolding in her mind. Leora refused to let fury guide her. She refused to grant them the victory of watching her fall apart. If they wanted to test her strength, she would prove it, but not in the way they imagined. She vowed in silence that the game they began would never finish on their terms. They believed they controlled her. Yet Leora quietly promised herself that she alone would decide the ending. For that, she would need composure, patience, and the mask of calm she wore so flawlessly. What no one at that table understood was that Leora was not nearly as simple as they assumed. Long before the wedding was even on the horizon, she had already prepared for moments like this. Her late father had left her more than memories. He had left her land, businesses, and investments. Piece by piece, with determination, she grew them into something far greater. Over the years, she transformed his estate into an empire worth $79 million. Still, she never boasted, never revealed her wealth, because she wanted to be loved for who she was, not for the fortune she carried. Her most trusted ally through it all was Amadi, her loyal lawyer. While others saw her as just a graceful young woman in love, Amadi knew the reality, her strength, her independence, and the vast empire she had secured. In silence, he helped her fortify it, drafting legal protections, establishing trusts, and safeguarding every cent in her name. Properties hidden in plain sight. Companies that flourished with no connection to her face. Accounts so untouchable that even Daxon's influential family could never reach them. To the world, it looked as though Leora was marrying into wealth. But in truth, she possessed more than they could imagine. The prenuptial agreement her future in-laws had proudly placed before her was no weapon at all. It was a challenge, yes, but one that would collapse on them instead. When her fingers brushed the pen, she already knew the game had shifted. Everything she owned was shielded, beyond Daxon's grasp, beyond his family's control. Signing meant nothing. It stripped nothing from her, offered them no advantage. They believed they had cornered her, but all they had truly revealed was their distrust and their smallness. She saw it clearly now. The trap was not hers, it was theirs. They had misjudged her, treating her as fragile and dependent, when she had been safeguarding far more than they could ever claim. Amadi, always watchful in the background, had anticipated this exact night. While Daxon's family reveled in their supposed triumph, he waited with the paperwork that could turn their world inside out. The shadow they thought lingered behind them was actually leading the way, guiding Leora toward the moment where she would reveal who truly held the power. All eyes were on Leora as the prenup rested on the table. Daxon's mother leaned back with folded arms, convinced she had pinned the bride-to-be into submission. His father looked smug, certain the victory was theirs. Even Daxon himself sat stiff, avoiding her eyes, silently pleading for her compliance. The room grew heavier with each passing second. The pen lay beside the pages, appearing to hold the weight of her entire future. Without hesitation, she reached for it. Her hands were steady. Her face betrayed no fear. She leaned forward and calmly signed her name. The silence deepened. For a beat, No one breathed. Then she set the pen down gently and slid the papers back across the table. The ink was still drying, but her heart remained steady, as though she had merely closed the final page of a test she had already conquered. Daxon's mother shot a victorious glance at his father, their lips curling in smug satisfaction, convinced they had shielded what mattered most. To them, this was her surrender. Daxon exhaled in relief, believing the storm had passed. But they were wrong. This act of quiet obedience was no surrender. It was strategy. Each stroke of her pen cost her nothing, for all that mattered had long since been secured. Her inheritance, her empire, her fortune, all safeguarded under Amadi's watchful eye. She had given them nothing, and they didn't even realize it. Beyond that room, Amadi waited patiently, his briefcase containing documents with more power than the prenup could ever hold. While Daxon's family basked in their false triumph, Amadi knew the truth. Leora had turned their trap into her stage. When the moment arrived, his papers would not merely shield her. They would expose the weakness of those who thought themselves strong. The silence they mistook for fragility was not weakness at all. It was the stillness before a storm they could never anticipate. A storm already prepared to dismantle their pride and turn it into ruin. In the days leading up to the wedding, whispers filled the air. Friends and relatives noticed how quiet Leora had remained after the prenup was signed. Many assumed her heart had been broken. Many assumed she had resigned herself to her fate. But Daxon's parents walked with their heads high, bragging to anyone who would listen that they had made the smart choice. They proudly declared that they had secured their son's wealth, ensuring no woman could ever exploit him. In their minds, they were victorious, and their smug grins grew bolder each day. The morning of the wedding arrived wrapped in excitement. Guests poured in, flowers were carefully arranged, and music drifted through the venue. But behind the cheerful bustle, a storm was quietly gathering. As Daxon's parents dressed for the grand ceremony, a firm knock rattled the door. A courier stood waiting, holding out an envelope sealed with authority. Inside lay an official legal notice. As their eyes scanned the stamped words, the color drained from their faces. Their accounts and assets had been frozen on the spot. Panic spread through the house like wildfire. The fortune they flaunted, the companies they controlled, the properties they boasted about, suddenly untouchable. Daxon's mother clung to the paper in disbelief, while his father barked for answers no one could give. Servants exchanged uneasy glances, realizing something was terribly amiss. The ground beneath this once secure family was crumbling fast. As the news spread, whispers swelled into louder murmurs. Guests at the wedding noticed the tension immediately. Rumors flew. How could such powerful people suffer humiliation on the very day their son was to be wed? The pride they flaunted so openly was unraveling before a crowd of watchful eyes. Leora, however, remained composed. She moved with calm grace, her face serene, as though nothing unusual had occurred. But deep inside, she knew this was the moment when the truth was finally breaking free. The snare they thought they had set for her had quietly snapped back against them. While they were busy parading their success in shielding Daxon's inheritance, they never realized their own empire was already slipping away. What was meant to be their greatest triumph had transformed into the stage for their downfall. And the storm had only begun. The shock of frozen assets swept like flames through the celebration. Guests whispered, journalists circled, and Daxon's parents struggled to maintain composure. They tried to smile, but their hands trembled, their eyes flicked nervously, and everyone around could sense disaster. That was when Amadi, Leora's lawyer, stepped forward. Calm and steady, he carried the papers that would shift everything. In a quiet but commanding voice, he revealed the truth long hidden. Leora had never depended on Daxon's wealth. Long before the prenup, even before the wedding was arranged, she had been carefully building her own foundation. Piece by piece, she had transformed her late father's estate into something formidable. Trusts untouchable. Businesses thriving under her management. Investments guarded by walls stronger than steel. And every part of it bore one name, hers. The number silenced the room. $79 million. That was the empire she had quietly built, an empire no one had seen coming. The parents who once ridiculed her as a gold digger now stood paralyzed with shame. Their carefully laid trap had not only failed, it had unveiled their arrogance to the world. While they obsessed over protecting their son's inheritance, Leora had been protecting a fortune far greater than theirs. Gasps filled the air as the revelation spread. Friends, family, and strangers alike turned toward her, not with pity, but with admiration. She was no longer seen merely as the elegant bride. She stood as a woman of true power, one who had played her hand with patience and brilliance. Amadi set the final documents on the table, proof that not a cent of her wealth could be touched by Daxon or his family. Every asset, every account, every holding remained firmly in her name. The prenup they had pushed so proudly now meant nothing against her foresight. For the first time, Daxon looked at her differently. He realized he had never truly grasped the depth of the woman he was about to marry. She had given him her heart, but never her security, and now he understood why. The quiet strength, the calm smile, the unshaken composure. It had all been part of a power far greater than he had imagined. In that instant, the balance of power shifted completely. The family who once believed themselves in control was stripped of it, while Leora stood tall, untouchable, her worth blazing brighter than ever. The revelation struck Daxon's parents like a blow they could not recover from. Just hours earlier, they had boasted proudly about protecting their son from a woman they assumed wanted his money. Now, exposed before the entire wedding hall, their pride had collapsed. No longer figures of authority and respect, they stood revealed as parents who had misjudged, insulted, and humiliated the very woman who surpassed them in strength and dignity. Friends who once flocked to their side whispered behind their backs. Guests who had applauded their speeches now shook their heads in disbelief. Every corner of the hall buzzed with their shame. Reporters swarmed like vultures, cameras flashing, questions flying. What was once their private arrogance was now a public scandal. Daxon's mother, who had so smugly slid the prenup across the table, avoided every glance. Her hands trembled as she clutched her pearls, realizing she had underestimated a woman whose quiet grace concealed unshakable power. Daxon's father, once stern and proud, was left speechless. The commanding voice he had built his reputation on was gone, leaving only silence. In just a single day, that image shattered. No one thought of him as wise anymore. Instead, they saw a man blinded by arrogance, his pride twisting into disgrace. At the heart of it all stood Leora, untouched by the shame drowning those around her. Rather than pity, she drew admiration. She had endured suspicion and betrayal with unshaken grace. Now, she radiated more brightly than ever before. Women praised her courage. Men acknowledged her sharpness. Younger guests whispered in awe, saying she was the kind of woman they wanted to become, or to marry. The very family that had tried to rob her of dignity had only stripped themselves bare. Their carefully polished reputation was now in ruins. The murmurs grew louder, and the harder they tried to avoid the stares, the more attention clung to them. The title they clung to, Guardians of Wealth, was gone. What remained was the truth. They had been cruel, petty, and wrong. As respect for Leora grew, the crushing weight of disgrace pressed down on Daxon's parents. The pride they had once wielded as a weapon was now the very cause of their collapse. Daxon watched everything crumble, their image, their honor, their pride. But what pierced him deepest was the sight of Leora, poised, strong, and unbroken, while he sat helpless. He loved her fiercely, yet he couldn't erase the memory of that dinner table, when the prenup was slid across to her and he said nothing. He had sat there in silence, watching her face fall. And that silence now weighed more heavily than any words could have. He edged closer, his voice low, almost desperate, pleading for forgiveness. He told her he had been torn between his love for her and his loyalty to his parents. He confessed his weakness, his failure to defend her when it mattered most. His eyes brimmed with regret as he vowed to stand by her now, no matter the cost. But Leora's heart was torn. She listened calmly, though inside, the pain of betrayal throbbed like a wound that refused to heal. She had loved him with everything she had, trusted him with her whole being. Yet when the moment came for him to prove his love, he chose silence. And that silence had spoken louder than anything. It told her she could not rely on him when it counted most. She looked at him, remembering nights of laughter, whispered promises, and the dreams they once wove together. A part of her longed to believe him, to cling to the love they had shared. But the part scarred by betrayal could not deny the truth. Love without trust was fragile, and broken trust was not easily restored. Daxon clasped her hand, vowing he would spend the rest of his life proving his devotion. But Leora no longer felt safe in his love. She saw both the man she had once dreamed of marrying and the man who had chosen his parents' pride over her dignity. Her silence now was not weakness, it was clarity. She realized she, too, had a choice: to forgive and carry the weight of his silence forever, or to walk away and choose herself. And though her heart still cared for him, she knew love scarred by betrayal could never be the same again. The wedding hall brimmed with anticipation as Leora made her way slowly toward the altar. Guests leaned forward, waiting for the moment when the bride and groom would join their lives. Daxon stood at the front, eyes locked on her, clinging to hope that she would still choose him despite it all. His parents sat stiffly, drowning in humiliation, yet desperate for the ceremony to continue, believing marriage might patch what pride had broken. Leora's gown shimmered under the lights, but it wasn't the dress that held everyone's gaze. It was her composure. Every step was steady, every movement sure. The battle inside her was already over. Her decision had been made. She had endured betrayal, humiliation, and doubt, but emerged stronger. And now, standing before the man she once wanted to marry, her heart carried only truth. The priest spoke the vows, inviting them to declare their promises. Daxon's voice trembled as he pledged eternal love and protection, his eyes begging for another chance. Then came Leora's turn. She met his gaze, her lips curving into the faintest smile, not of happiness but of strength. She did not raise her voice. She did not expose him or his parents further. Instead, she leaned close, her whisper sharp enough to cut through the air. "You wanted me to prove my love," she said softly. "Instead, I proved my worth." Her words pierced deeper than any anger could. Daxon's heart sank, realizing this was not a vow, it was farewell. Leora stepped back, lifted her gown with grace, and turned from the altar. The crowd gasped as she walked down the aisle alone, her head high, her freedom shining brighter than any jewel. Each step declared her dignity was worth more than a marriage built on silence and lies. Guests murmured, some shocked, others in awe. What was meant to be a union had become a lesson, a moment no one would ever forget. Leora did not leave as a bride abandoned. She left as a woman who had chosen herself. Her strength, her freedom, and her worth outweighed any promise born of distrust. And as the doors closed behind her, all knew she had stepped into a future far brighter than the one offered at that altar.